Hello and welcome to the GLB podcast, where we drive business growth and spark innovations across the globe. I am your host, Dr. Chuma Osuchukwu, and the author of the best-selling book, The Learning Leader and the 5 Perspectives of Change Leadership, the 3rd edition. I'm also the founder of the Global Leaders and Business Awards. Every single week, I sit down with visionary leaders, I sit down with bold innovators, with change makers who are shaping industries across the globe, inspiring transformation all over the whole place. So get ready for fresh insights, powerful stories, and practical strategies that will elevate your business leadership and fuel your success. Now, let's dive into today's conversation with my special guest, Dr. Larisa Corda. Dr. Larisa Corda is an obstetrician and gynecologist who has become a pioneering voice in alternative fertility care, innovation, and advocacy. A graduate of Imperial College London, she trained in both the UK and Australia, gaining a global perspective on gynecology, obstetrics, and reproductive health. She has been the resident fertility expert on ITV's This Morning, where she has become a trusted source of compassionate and evidence-based guidance for ITV viewers. But beyond the screen, Dr. Corda is the visionary behind the Conception Plan, a groundbreaking 12-week holistic program that integrates modern medicine with Eastern wellness practices. Her approach is revolutionizing fertility treatment by addressing the physical and spiritual dimensions of women's well-being. She has been working with global organizations such as UN Women, the Cycle, the Endometriosis UK. Her dedication has earned her numerous accolades, including the We Are the City Rising Star in Healthcare Award, a nomination for the BBC Radio London Make a Difference Award during the pandemic, and most recently, the Global Medical Research Award from the Global Leaders and Business Awards London. Dr. Corda is here not just to talk about medicine, but transformation in healthcare, in society, and how we think about fertility and wellness. Dr. Larisa Corda, you're welcome.
Thank you so much for having me in that introduction. I feel like we've done half the podcast now, really.
Indeed. I had to cut the introduction short because if I were to tell people all about you, that would be a podcast in itself, an episode in itself.
Well, that's very sweet, but I'm sure that's the case for all of your guests, some of who I had the pleasure of meeting at the wonderful event you hosted recently. And they're such a special bunch, aren't they?
Indeed. Indeed, it was an incredible event. And we are still in the kind of flow that event created, the momentum.
Yeah, it was really special.
The award was incredible. So, and we want to make the next one is sure going to be by far better than that.
Oh, wow.
There's so much in the fireworks right now.
I can't wait.
There's so much in the fireworks. So let's dive into the GLB podcast, Dr. Larisa. Your career spans continents. You've been in the UK, you trained in the UK, you trained in Australia, and you've gained more like a global perspective when it comes to holistic approach to fertility and women's health. So what really inspired you to go in the direction you're going right now, the direction of the holistic medicine?
Yeah. So when I trained in Australia, I took time out to do that from my UK practice, and that was going back just over 10 years ago now. And that was what I would call my Saturn return experience, astrologically speaking. And it was a very, very powerful experience, because I think a lot of us, certainly back then, associated Australia with the land of the free and the alternative. And the exposure that I had when I lived there was that people were certainly doing things in a really creative way. And they also had the freedom to be able to do that. And I started to also have my sort of initial foray into some of these more alternative esoteric modalities, some of which I was applying on myself and learning about. And then others I could see a very real role for when it came to clients and patients. And so as I left Australia, and that was a really difficult thing for me to do, to make that decision, because it's such an incredible place and it had such a huge impact on my life, both professionally and personally. I then returned to the UK, and being so influenced by that experience, it became quite apparent to me as I was treating patients and looking after them that there were certain aspects that were really missing for me, and that, especially when it came to chronic conditions, chronic reproductive conditions, yes, we had, a medical means of providing some sort of relief for patients, but quite often that wasn't fully adequate, and it came with many side effects at times. Other times we could surgically intervene, but none of these interventions really provided a cure. And I was really intrigued by what we could do, how we could go a step further to help people who presented with chronic conditions, whether they were endometriosis, PCOS, or the struggle to conceive for whatever reason that may be. And I started to look at those through a more holistic lens of implementing things that I had learned and I'd had experience of into what I'd been taught down the Western route. And I started to see that all of those things began to make a difference. So in particular, when we look at the condition of unexplained infertility, which is what over 33% of people who in a heterosexual couple who present and are unable to conceive within the space of whether it's 6 months, if they're slightly older, or a year, get diagnosed with. And to me, this is quite possibly the most frustrating diagnosis that anyone can have, because when someone tells you that they can't explain why you're having the problem that you have, it almost feels a little bit like you're being gaslit over the entire experience, right? Because there is a very real problem, yet medical science can't quite explain it. Seemingly all these tests have been done and there appears to be no reason, but yet there must be a reason, because there is something that is causing the problem and the manifestation of that problem. So that particular sector also really started to intrigue me with regards to wanting to go further, wanting to investigate and do the research behind what might be causing that. And the more patients I was seeing, and the more that I started to get into people's stories and life experiences, I was always that doctor that took the longest to see patients, because I would always be intrigued by what these patients were presenting with. And, I always honored the fact that for someone to come to the doctor, and that is still the case, for someone to present to the doctor, it's such a huge deal for them, right? And you want to be able to give them that space and time to be able to express what they need to. So their life story started to intrigue me, and I started to piece together certain patterns of being able to draw certain correlations between what patients were telling me they'd experienced earlier in their lives, which was quite often related to a subconscious level of trauma. They may not even have recognized or admitted prior to that point, and what was then going on for them later in life and how that was beginning to manifest on a physical level. So it became more obvious to me that there was a very direct correlation between what was going on mentally and emotionally for them, and this went for the men and the women, and what they were actually coming to me or another doctor about.
Yes.
And that, to me, was probably that pivotal sort of turning point of being able to recognize, that mainstream medicine at the moment, in terms of how we provide it in the West, didn't really have a means of being able to deal with the person as a whole.
Yes.
And instead, we were looking at their individual diagnoses and conditions in a very dismembered way, right? So we would just be, if someone came, for example, with endometriosis, a condition that's very common, we would purely focus on what was going on at the reproductive end, but actually there were a whole range of other things going on within that person that would be affecting many other systems, as women with endometriosis are all too aware of. And that this pain, which is the commonest presentation of endometriosis that manifests as a result of this condition and the inflammation that's going on behind it, actually was being contributed to on so many different levels, that including the immune, the neurological, the endocrine, the biochemical, but also, really importantly, the mental and emotional levels, which were inputting into all of these other systems, meaning that endometriosis or any other condition, in my experience and from what I was witnessing, would be the downstream effect of all of these other events that were going on before that and contributing to it. And only dealing with, let's say, endometriosis through the purely surgical and medical route just simply wasn't enough to address all of these other dimensions that were contributing to it. And I was always really interested in being able to get to the root cause rather than just treating things peripherally in terms of what we could see. So much of what we don't see is actually causing and creating the bigger picture. So that's what really started me on this path of wanting to find a way to merge the benefits of these incredible alternative esoteric healing modalities that were already out there, that have been out there for so many thousands of years and generations, and really integrating them into the practice of mainstream medicine, which also has its own benefits, and really trying to marry these worlds of science and spirit together, which people often see as diametrically opposite to one another. But I see very differently to that. I have found in my experience that they inevitably belong to one another. And actually, you can't really be spiritual unless you're also scientific, and vice versa. A true scientist is also very spiritual too, as the examples of Einstein and Nikola Tesla show us. So yes, this is my big passion and what I do.
Indeed. How did you have to deal with this whole process of consulting patients and trying to hear their stories within the confines of outcome based approach that NHS was doing at the time, wanting to see as many patients as you could within a very short space of time? How did you have to manage that?
Yeah, I think I really struggled with that. I think many doctors will probably tell you they struggle with that. It is really, really difficult to be able to fully see a patient within the very limited time frame that you have working for a huge institution like the NHS. And people are doing incredible things within the NHS, which I have been a part of and contributed to for many years. And one of the proudest and greatest things we have in the UK is our NHS. But there are a lot of demands that come with seeing a really large volume of patients. And also the fact, when we really trace it back down to the basics, that because we don't yet have this integrated holistic model of care, people keep representing with either the same symptoms or with just another iteration of the same condition. And that's what becomes very difficult about it, that we're not really necessarily at the moment being able to provide a cure. And from my experience and from what I grew increasingly frustrated by, was the fact that I didn't feel people were necessarily being empowered to be able to do something for themselves. And instead, we were providing them with a model of care that would be about the fix-it approach, something that the doctor gives you, and that goes on to help fix the problem. But, there is no such thing as a fix-it. And actually I think that, this is globally speaking as well. I think it is time for all of us to be able to embrace a different model of care, which is also about patients and clients learning and understanding that there is so much that they can do to help to improve their condition. And I do think, that a lot of people find that empowering when you tell them and you provide them the education and the means to be able to understand how to do that. At the moment, because there's so little education out there and we don't really have a focus on preventative healthcare, we instead have reactive systems. When people are already ill or people already have a problem, then we seek to help them. But I think the shift needs to come in being able to empower people to do things for themselves, to prevent themselves from getting to the point and the stage of illness. And if they do, that they also understand and that they can, that we can also help them to integrate an approach where, yes, sure, we can provide them with certain things, whether it's medication or whether it's, homeopathic remedies or an alternative treatment or a surgical procedure to help, but that the mainstay of that and the maintenance when it comes to looking after your health has to come from the individual, and that there are shared responsibilities when it comes to that. You see, I don't certainly myself regard myself as the person who will fix things for other people. I am an empowerer, and I am an enabler for people to be able to help themselves. But I don't think anyone can truly do that for someone else, nor is it something that I think would necessarily empower them. The most powerful thing to do is to realize that there is a lot that you can control, that you get to influence, and that you can actually, directly impact yourself. So I feel it's really important to educate people within that field and to allow them the benefit of that understanding, something that's very different, I think, to how a lot of medicine has been presented up until recently.
When we're picking up those alternative ways and discussing them, obviously, with your patients, what was it like? How did they receive it? Being used to the traditional Western, kind of medicine, and here you're saying something that is not directly the pills they know and they have been taking all along. How did they respond to that?
Well, first of all, I think most of them had a very open, in fact, all of them had a very open approach. The people that come to see me now seek me out for a reason, because they have already done the research themselves. They've already tried potentially lots of different things, and they understand the benefit of an integrated approach, one that's truly collaborative rather than polarizing, right? It's not about one or the other. It's about, let's take an approach that merges the best of both worlds, of the West and the East. And a lot of them have, what's really interesting is sometimes patients would say to me that, they'd reached the end of their tether or the end of the line with certain medical treatments and they were about to give up, and then they tried some alternative therapies, and that's when the change really happened for them. And they weren't quite sure why that was, but they were prepared to give it a go. And it struck me that actually, if people could understand the benefit of using those therapies alongside mainstream medicine from the beginning or much earlier on in their course of treatment rather than towards the end, that could really help to improve the speed of their recoveries and also, you know, the overall outcome that they have. So the people that I've certainly seen have all had an open approach, and actually even the ones who were a little bit more should we say skeptical, mainly because I guess it's so unusual to see you know, a doctor who also practices in these fields and understands, you know, we call it the alternative esoteric side, but really it's the complementary side of mainstream medicine.
Complementary, that's a better terminology to use there.
Exactly, yeah. Because they
Okay.
really, all of these techniques complement what we're already trying to do as doctors. And you know, even the ones who haven't had experience of alternative therapies in the past, or dare I say it usually does tend to be the men who sort of, you know, get dragged in by their partners, and you know, they're listening. But I have to give them all amazing credit because, you know, they really do commit to the path, and they, providing they have an openness to it, they start to see the benefits for themselves fairly early on. So by the time, you know, we finish our work together, or, you know, there's a certain milestone that they've reached, it's really, really interesting to see, actually, in particular, the people who may have initially had a little bit of resistance to it, how much they appreciate it, and actually the changes and transformations that they undergo. And I always say that, and this is something I've observed as well, that those places where we carry our greatest resistance and perhaps our sort of most vulnerable wounds are also the places where we stand to make the greatest transformation in life, if we can just embrace them. And that's what's so powerful about being able to really look after people in this truly holistic way, because you really get to see them undergo that transformation, not just physically, but also mentally, emotionally, and spiritually too.
Indeed. And how did your colleagues who are fixated on Western medicine, you know, see that?
Well, this is a really interesting one, because, you know, I almost at the beginning, when I started doing this, expected many of them to perhaps find it a little bit strange or different. But actually, it's been the opposite. That I think many of them, even though it may not be something that they necessarily engage with, many of them find it really intriguing. And, you know, I was recently at an event where, let's say, most of the people who were speaking were talking purely in terms of mainstream Western science and medicine. And I was the only person in the room who spoke about this. You know, I brought in aspects of this alternative side, and I almost expected sort of people, you know, to have a more polarizing reaction, but they really didn't. And in fact, they came up to me at the end and wanted to find out more. They wanted to understand what it was that I was doing, how they could integrate it into their practice. I mean, there's several, you know, IVF clinics and centers that have spoken to me about bringing some of this on board. And that is a really beautiful thing, because actually it makes you realize that this shift, which we're seeing, this renaissance in healthcare and medicine, which is happening, is very real, and that many doctors are now going down, I would say, are evolving into healers, because being a doctor doesn't necessarily make you a healer. A healer is someone who is also able to become the embodiment of certain practices that you will commit to yourself, and are therefore able to translate down to the level of the patient. And that requires a further level of evolution, I would say, in terms of embracing the whole breadth and width of these holistic therapies that are out there and which exist, and being able to express and offer them in a way that's truly congruent with your practice and has that has a level of impact that isn't just physical, but actually for the client feels very emotional too. And I think that is the way that medicine is moving. I see so many more of my colleagues and, midwives, doulas, and so on, who are all engaging in similar practices and doing courses and trainings to learn more about these complementary techniques and methods and how they can offer them to their patients. So I do think that medicine as a whole is evolving. And I would love to see medicine one day truly being what it, I guess, used to be many generations ago, which was this incredible, healing profession that was there to offer a whole breadth and width of different things to people rather than just focusing on one particular narrative.
Incredible. I was going to go in that direction, but there's something that, I want to recycle back to when you started talking. You were talking about the missing link. Now, the missing link in terms of the patients coming around, going through the normal tests and everything that they had to go through. What did you do? What did you do? What did you do to address that particular missing link?
The missing link. I think I'm just a naturally curious and inquisitive person. That's my Gemini moon, you see. I'm constantly questioning and researching and wanting to understand more about the world around me, but also the people. And I think it became very frustrating, actually, personally, for me to kind of accept unexplained as a diagnosis or to give to someone. I just really struggled to give anyone that kind of, reasoning, which to me felt totally inadequate and felt as if, we as a profession had failed them, to sort of say, well, we can't find a reason. And it's because, that there were, as I going back to chronic conditions and so on, where there are many people who, live with these conditions long term and are troubled by certain symptoms that they just learn to put up with, whereas they get benefit in others. To me, again, it felt inadequate that people would, just have to put up with certain things rather than getting to the bottom, the root cause of what might be going on. And then I started to research a field of science called epigenetics, which, a couple of years ago was something no one had really heard of. And I remember going to my first Congress and hearing this word. And that in itself just opened up all of these different rabbit holes that I started to go down, and I started to research, and it started to become more and more obvious to me that actually, whereas before the old paradigm that we used to believe in science and medicine, which was that genes dictated our fate and what we inherited was really set even before we were born, and that there was very little that we could do about that, actually that paradigm wasn't correct, and in fact has completely shifted now into a space where we now have evidence and understand far more that it's the epigenetics, so what's happening at the surface level above these genes, which includes all of our behaviors, all of the choices that we make, all of our life experiences. That is what is regulating gene behavior. And in fact,
let me stop you here. Let me stop you here, because this is important, and I want our listeners, our audience, to understand what this epigenetics is all about. What is it in a layman's language? What would you say, is epigenetics? Yes. What does that mean?
So epigenetics is really what sits on top of our genes. So it is made up of a whole series of proteins which control gene behavior, how the genes get to express and what they actually do in our bodies. So even if you inherit, for example, a genetic condition, the way that it expresses in you could be different to how it expresses in someone else based on your epigenetics. So this is where, as I mentioned, all of the things that we do in our life, and what we eat, how we exercise, how we approach and manage stress, the trauma we may have had and experienced, how we've integrated that, our approach to life, the experiences that we've had, how they've been processed by our bodies, all of that gets to make a difference at the epigenetic level. And it means that we have direct control of that. And it also means that the parents to be have direct control of that and what they pass on to their children. So this is no longer a case of us being resigned to our fate. This is a case of us being direct collaborators in terms of our destinies and what's happening for us in this lifetime, and also in the lifetime of our children that are to come. So that to me is super exciting.
This podcast continues in the next part. Yeah, so parents can determine what happens to their children by their lifestyle. Is that what you mean?
Absolutely. So this is what I really focus on, helping people to understand that, if they make an effort to improve the level of their own health and try to heal through various different issues that might be affecting their wellness and health, not just at the physical level, but also mental and emotional, that this stands to make a difference, not just in their lives and what happens to them later in life, how they go through the menopause, the andropause and beyond, how they experience being pregnant, what happens postnatally. That's another huge subject that we can get into as well. But also what happens to their children, the health of their children, which is absolutely predetermined by what's going on at the level of our cells and our sperm and egg specifically, and what's passed down to them. So yes, there's going to be certain genetics that they inherit, but there's also going to be a certain, though the epigenetic environment is actually reprogrammed at the point of fertilization, there are also certain epigenetic factors which are passed down, and interestingly are mainly related to the nervous system and our neurological processing. So this is where being able to do a level of healing that addresses trauma, that addresses adverse life experiences that we might have had, is super important, because it does also stand to benefit the children that are born afterwards.
Could this be the reason then behind the conception plan you came up with?
Yeah, you got it.
How did that affect the conception plan? How did it help you in setting up the conception plan?
So the conception plan was really born out of this need to want to merge and marry lots of different modalities and dimensions into what I was already practicing as a doctor. Yeah. And being able to provide people with a truly holistic approach that was able to look after and care for their health physically, mentally, emotionally, and also, really importantly, spiritually as well, because conception is that unique point in time and that interface between the material realm and the spiritual realm. And to me, there is nothing more miraculous and more special than being able to to commune with that process and to understand more about it and to become an enabler for someone to be able to manifest life here on earth. So the period leading up to conception, which is the preconception period, is something I'm really passionate about promoting and supporting people in, because this is something that doesn't really exist out there. You know, a lot of people don't really get taught the importance of the preconception period, which is at least 3 months prior to the lead up to becoming pregnant, but ideally, you know, is a year or longer, where you're focusing around healing various different aspects of yourself in order to become the healthiest version you can possibly be prior to conceiving your child. And, you know, this requires commitment. It requires someone who is already in quite an evolved state of being to be able to brace and approach some really difficult aspects that, you know, they may have buried for a really long time. They may never have had the courage to witness before, where societies, you know, had told them to carry on and be a certain way in order to succeed in life. Yet, you know, they may have faced quite a significant level of trauma that they've never ever had a chance to address, and all of a sudden it's brought up through the conception process. And, you know, when we move into the phase of being pregnant and then giving birth, that really sacred point in time for a woman, and then the man who's supporting, or the partner who's supporting the woman who's pregnant, is so important, not just when it comes to the mother's health later in life and her whole family's health, but the child's health as well. And also, I would argue, our society's health too. Because if we don't support and look after our mothers who are giving birth to the future generations, they, as we are seeing through statistics that have just recently this week come out in the US, maternal mental health is at an all-time low. So it has significantly reduced since 2016, between 2016 and 2023. And where very few women are actually reporting good levels of postnatal mental health. And why is that? I think one of the main reasons is because there is absolutely no level of preconception support that is going on in terms of allowing people to understand the importance of investing in themselves prior to becoming pregnant. But even more importantly, of society's understanding the investment that needs to be made in that to support people to be able to have the care that they need to become pregnant, and then supporting people whilst they're pregnant as well as afterwards. And postnatal care, certainly in the Western world, is almost non-existent. You know, unlike indigenous cultures and other practices around the world, where, you know, there is a really that there is a period of time, which is usually 40 days, that is given towards and invested in the woman who is recovering from birth, who has now become a mother, who has undergone her greatest life transition to date. There is an investment that's made societally, that's made, you know, by families, that's made by all of the relationships that woman has in her life. Yet we don't see that. We don't see that in the Western world. And then we wonder why mothers are suffering so much, why families are suffering so much, and why so many children who are born out of families where, you know, their mothers may not be able to care for them and to provide for them because they're debilitated by a situation that they're dealing with, end up and go on to also have issues and problems themselves, whether it's with their health, whether it's with their physical health, their mental health, their emotional health. This is all because there is no investment made at that preconception point. And if you speak to people, as I have, who are sociologists, who are people who are caring for children that may be having behavioral difficulties and issues later in life, all of them will tell you that actually, from all that they've seen and done through working with these children and the families, goes back to the point of conception, preconception, and how the mothers were supported and looked after when they were pregnant and prior to that. And I think we have to start. admitting that in our societies and getting very real about the fact that at the moment, something that stands to influence so many generations that are coming after ours and the generation that we currently exist in has absolutely zero investment and support when it comes to the Western world. And that has to change.
That is incredibly insightful. And we're going to explore a whole lot of things you've said here. I think there is so much to unpack in what you have said so far. But time constraint is a factor for us today. So you're going to come back on this program. You're going to come back to GLB podcast to pick up from where we're ending today. But there is so much here. If a woman, for example, has gone to the hospital, done all the relevant tests with the man, and the hospital says, both of you okay, So, and the question is, why are we not then conceiving? What is the problem here? And what you are saying so far is that it could be other things other than, medical conditions. And these other things can be, psychological, it could be spiritual, it could be any other thing, in the process. So tell us a little bit, how does the conception plan work? How does it work?
So the conception plan exists in a couple of different formats at the moment. So the first one that people might be most familiar with is the book that I've written, which came out right at the end of 2023, and which goes into detail on some of the subjects we've covered here, like epigenetics, the role of trauma, and then various different conditions that we've also mentioned, like PCOS, endometriosis, and really importantly goes into detail over the emotional lens and contributing factors that could be having an impact on someone's ability to conceive. But in addition to that, it also has a 12-week program embedded within it, which is a practical program that people can follow and addresses the 5 main pillars of health and reproductive health in particular. So they are diet, exercise, stress management, toxin-free living or reducing the chemical burden you're living under, and sex and relationships. So all of those 5 pillars are integrated within the 12-week approach, as well as self-affirmations and practices that I teach people how to do to be able to literally spend no money if they don't have it or don't want to, and just commit to a process at home that they do themselves to improve their natural reproductive health. Now, this also goes for people who are doing IVF, who are doing IUI, who are using other reproductive technologies where there may be a very real need for that. All of these techniques also complement what's going on there and attempt to give you a better outcome and a faster outcome as well in terms of what you're looking for when it comes to not just improving your health and your chances of conceiving, but also the health of the child that's born. And then more recently, I've just launched the Conception Plan program, which you can find details of on my website, theconceptionplan.com. And this is a program running over 3 months that brings to life all of these different techniques and methods and helps to support people who want a different approach to their health, who want to have a truly holistic, integrated application when it comes to dealing with a condition that they might have or helping to improve their chances of becoming pregnant. And I work with 4 incredible experts and coaches in this who are all amazing in their individual fields and cover all of the different pillars that I've mentioned within the conception plan, so they can offer that direct support to people regardless of where they live in the world, because you're a global podcast for a reason, and I really believe in making a business truly global so that people, no matter where they are in the world, can access this. And that's something that is about to start in June, and that I will be running. And for anyone who wants to find out details, they can go online. And the final, I guess, iteration so far of what I am doing with the conception plan is also individual consultations for those who want to engage with these practices and really look at conception or their health through that truly holistic approach, multidimensional approach, shall I say.
Looking ahead in terms of innovation and in terms of transformation, what do you see as it relates to fertility issues, women and fertility issue? What do you see?
So I think if I was anyone else, the answer you would probably have to this question is going to be AI. Because that is what so many institutions are adopting at the moment. That is what is growing at a truly unbelievable pace, and it's making its way into all of our professions, including the reproductive and health sector. Now, the answer I'm going to give you is actually going to be one that's different to that, and in response to that, because I actually feel that the way we should be moving is very much more back to basics rather than becoming more reliant on these technologies. I think that the danger that we stand to encounter here is to outsource our power even more to these external technologies, believing that actually there's very little that we can do to help influence our health and conception. And I believe the opposite is true. I think that actually technologies should only be used as a result of an evolved level of consciousness and responsibility that comes through having really grown far more discerning over how we use them. Just because we can doesn't mean that we should. And
I like that. Just because we can doesn't mean we should.
Exactly. And if
what do you mean?
Well, I think that we have the means to do a lot of things at the moment, but there are a whole load of ethics attached to them. And the issue, one of the greatest issues that I believe we face with the integration of AI, if it goes on unregulated and practiced in a way that isn't congruent with ethical values, is transhumanism, and is, beginning to outsource something that is innately human to robotics and machines. And if we do that, I think we lose the essence of actually who we are on a human level, which is spiritual beings, bringing and helping to bring life into the world through a spiritual means. And conception and the field that I work with is at the very interface of that. And I think that we have great responsibilities when it comes to being able to discern between what is congruent with being a sentient human being and what is not. And there is a place for technologies, of course there is, in terms of assistance and help, but I think that the level of consciousness that needs to be applied to them is one that needs to be far more evolved and advanced than the one that we have at the moment, where the potential for distortion is pretty big. So to me, I would love to see a reclamation of power by the patient, by the people who need to be able to understand that there is so much that they can do to influence their own health and what happens to them and how they conceive, and to do that in a way that brings them back home, back to themselves, and to being able to do that via a process of healing that stands to benefit them as well as future generations, not a process of bypassing where we effectively bypass the healing element that needs to occur here, which does then have transgenerational repercussions that will at some point need to be addressed. But we have those responsibilities now. We have all of that information. We have a huge level of understanding on why it's important to address preconception health, why it's important to address our health, full stop, and what we can do about it and the consequences that that has. And I believe that we need to use that information responsibly and in a way, especially when we're dealing with helping people to conceive future generations, in a way that honors the sacredness of that, rather than treating that as a purely mechanical procedure, which it is not.
When you talked about outsourcing what humans should do to AI, my mind just went to the robots I've seen on social media, who are carrying babies now, and like a science fiction. And we know that some of the science fictions, with time, people start experimenting into actualizing them into becoming real. And it has happened in space explorations and things like that. Do you see any future of that happening? Do you see robots carrying babies?
Well, I think it's already beginning to happen. I think Japan has just, if I'm not mistaken, reported that they've created the first artificial womb outside of the body, as in an incubator that is able to carry and support life. Again, it's going back to just because we can really doesn't mean that we should. And this has huge ethical implications, as has genetic engineering, as have so many of these biotechnologies. And yes, I mean, this is advancing at a speed that feels very alarming to many people before we've had a chance to have any real conversations over it and actually evolve our own level of understanding about the implications that this might carry. So I think we really need to be able to rein and draw this in and understand that actually this is happening at a speed which, if it goes on, will become unregulated, will start to be misused for certain purposes that it wasn't created for in the first place. And, there is already evidence of that, as you say, across social media, across, what is happening in so many other sectors where the potential for harm actually starts to really to outbalance what actually these technologies were designed for in the first place. So having the technologies comes with a great deal of responsibilities. And, even in the practice of IVF, which has been going on for, since the 1970s now, it's really, really important that we bring a level of consciousness to it where we understand that actually the way that it's currently being used, in my opinion, being overused a lot of the time, isn't necessarily correct, and that there is a whole process of healing that should also be going on behind the scenes to help people to have the results that they wish to have. So all of these technologies, no matter how long they've been around for, I think we need to refine our level of awareness and the consciousness with which we practice using these technologies.
My last question before I let you go today is this. For somebody on a fertility journey whose primary aim is to have a baby, what would be your advice to that person?
I think it would be to understand just how sacred and important a role being a parent is. It's really, for anyone who's been a parent, they will tell you it is the biggest role of their lives. and that carries many beautiful and incredible responsibilities. And along with that, there is a process that they can engage in to be able to, as one of my patients actually put it, and I will use her words, to learn to parent yourself again. And, I think that's something that when she told me that and the benefit of working with me and the impact it had on her, it really touched me, because I think that is the case for a lot of people. It's learning to come home to themselves. It's learning to love themselves enough to be able to heal certain aspects of themselves, moving into parenthood and all of what that brings. And it's also about understanding the spiritual role of what being a parent is about and how that gets to influence future generations. It is the most powerful role in the world, and I think it deserves the correct level of support and understanding as such, which is, why all of what I do is about helping to support the parents of tomorrow. And even the meaning behind the conception plan, which a lot of people take to mean purely as just being focused around having a child, is about so much more than that. It is about the process of giving birth to yourself again and evolving and expanding the capacity within yourself to move from one state of being into another. So I'll leave you with that. I think for me, that's probably the biggest advice I'd give to someone moving into that super special role.
Amazing. That's it for today, Dr. Larisa, and it's been a pleasure having this conversation with you.
Oh, it's been my pleasure.
I look forward to another conversation of this nature, because you've opened a lot of channels that need exploration. So we will talk about it again. But for now, thank you for coming. And it's been a pleasure.
Thank you so much for having me, and to be continued.
Yes, to be continued. Take care.